So, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, to the latest in our Expert Insights webinar series. Today's session, I'm very delighted to say, is going to be around optimization of market access for cell and gene therapies. My name is James Wright. I'm Director at Valid Insight, and I will be moderating the panel today alongside my colleague Stephen Hall. The panel, I'm very excited to say, we have three experts in the field, Professor Chris Boyk, Professor Gianluigi Cassidy, and Raf de Vilda. And maybe just to begin with, if I could pass over to our panelists, starting with Raf. Maybe a brief introduction from yourself, Raf, please.
Okay. When I was asked if I could do the role of the industry person in this meeting, I thought, yeah, that's a good idea, because I've been working in the industry for many years in pricing products, and in the last 9 years I am consulting on pricing products, so I do know what's going on there and how this is moving. So my background, after many years at Janssen Pharmaceuticals and the other trademarks that it went over in time, I joined consulting companies, large ones first 9 years ago, and joined Valid Insight at its start, so 4 years and a few months ago, where I am senior executive advisor. So enough about me, I guess.
Thank you very much, Raf. And Gianluigi, maybe passing over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Gianluigi Casadei. I'm a physician by background. I spent several years in clinical research as well as in regulatory affairs within a major pharmaceutical company. And then almost 12 years ago, I moved to the academic side of the world. I'm currently working as a health consultant, as well as I'm teaching health economics at the University of Milan, both for the Faculty of Pharmacy and Medicine.
Thank you very much, Gianluigi. And Chris?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Boyke. I'm a professor of health economics that specializes in health technology assessment. I've been in health economics for about 20 years now. I'm currently the director of the academic unit of health economics at the University of Leeds. But I've also worked extensively at NICE and the Safe Staffing Committee, and I'm currently on the Public Health Advisory Committee. I also serve as one of their experts on the early scientific advice services that they offer. I'm also allowed to do a little bit of private consultancy work as well, so I have been found on the other side of the NICE table representing pharmacy in terms of the economic models that they have produced. Most recently, actually, I was responsible for the ultimately successful health economic model that was presented tonight for Holoclaw, Europe's first stem cell technology. So I assume that my experiences in the nightmare of getting that through will be particularly pertinent for the discussion today, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And it's great to have such a wide range of panel members for this discussion today. Before I start, a few housekeeping rules. I can see some messages coming through the chat around the sound. The first housekeeping rule, please do check you've joined via the Adobe app rather than the browser connection. There are sound issues at times with the browser connection. So if you could join via the app, then all sound issues will be sorted. The audience is muted. Any questions that you do have, please do type them into the chat box. At the end of the session, we will be looking at those questions, and certainly there'll be an opportunity to ask the panel the questions that come up. Importantly, all opinions from the panel discussed within the webinar are personal views, so not representative of any of the companies that they may have worked for in the past or currently do. So, why are we talking about cell and gene therapies? Well, it's been a long-standing issue. The idea of gene therapies, or the idea of altering genes to treat genetic diseases, goes back now 50 years. It did take a while until the first clinical trial using the viral vector occurred back in 1990. And since then, it's been a slow development process in many ways due to the complexity. We had our first cell and gene therapy in the US approved in 2017. We now have 9 approved by the FDA and 10 by the EMA in Europe. But this hasn't stopped. This long lag time between development hasn't stopped future development. Looking back into February this year, there were 362 cell and gene therapies in clinical development from phase 2 onwards, which is an increase of around 70 in the last 2 years. Now, what we see is that the gene therapy is being spread across therapy areas. Obviously, we can see in the graph here that oncology dominates, but even in cardiovascular and hematology and ophthalmology, where we know that there's significant shifts in development and in approvals. These types of therapies come with their challenges, though, and there's quite a wide variety of challenges. 3 that we're going to focus on today are around evidence generation, are around reimbursement and affordability, and around the infrastructure and service delivery that comes with it as well. There are obviously a number of challenges outside of these, and maybe we can pick those up. But to begin with, the areas that we're going to look at in terms of evidence generation, we know that the patient populations are often small in these areas, and in terms of generating evidence, that in itself can be a challenge. Many of the clinical trials are developed with surrogate endpoints, which we know particularly in Europe in terms of the health authorities' appraisal presents its own challenges as well. And then lastly, particularly around the benefits, how do you accurately measure long-term benefits in a clinical trial that maybe lasts 1, 2, sometimes 3 years, and maybe has extensions on the back of that? But presenting that to health authorities in a short-term clinical trial has its issues. When we come to reimbursement and affordability, generally speaking, these are high-cost medicines. One-off treatments or perhaps subsequent treatments present health authorities who are used to a different model in terms of payments and contracting, creates huge issues for them in terms of the infrastructure that they have for appraisals and pricing reimbursement. And then in terms of that infrastructure and service delivery, the types of products often require specialised models of care and delivery by specialists, and not just specialists within their own therapy area, but actually within the subpopulations and those very small populations where there's very few true specialists within that disease. And then there's issues around the supply chain as well. How do we produce enough product to be able to deliver to those? Those are the issues we're going to look at, and maybe if I move into the panel discussion, we'll start off with the evidence generation. And maybe just an open question to Chris. Maybe I could start with you. How important is the evidence generation component of an assessment for cell and gene therapies?
It's very important. I mean, it's no less or more important than it is for any other health technology assessment. We know we've got very limited funds and unlimited wants and needs. So any kind of use of those resources has to be backed up by good evidence. Now, as you've suggested, it's extremely challenging for these types of technologies to generate a good, sufficient, strong evidence base. And we really need to look at those, and I think it's a little bit detailed. There's several things we can do here. The first thing is to recognize that the evidence base is always going to be reasonably weak compared to other technologies which have got large patient numbers and have had large RCTs performed, and that what we need to do is to fully explore those uncertainties and understand the consequences of those uncertainties. And I think very importantly as well, indicate to health authorities that you are willing to risk share in the generation of new evidence and the outcomes that they may produce. But the other thing I think we need to really think about as well, you can really help yourselves here, is to determine what sort of evidence you need to generate and what is the important bits of evidence. And I think in health economics, we have, we're often regarded as the fourth hurdle, and a lot of pharmaceutical companies, even the big ones, tend to do this last. What I would suggest, especially for you guys, is that you bring this forward right to the beginning. So you know you're going to have to produce a health economic model to justify the costs. So it has to be done at some point. If you do this at the beginning, in the absence really of any data, to determine what the drivers are of the costs and the values, what mechanisms you think are important, you can then begin to piece together this model. At that point, you can then start to say, well, what bits of evidence do we have to populate that model? And then importantly, what you can do is you can look to see, well, where are the evidence gaps? What are the uncertainties? And most importantly, how important are those uncertainties? So you can do several sort of health economic components like value of information techniques, which tell you, actually, this is very uncertain, but isn't important at all in determining whether this is cost effective. Therefore, we shouldn't waste any time or effort in trying to generate that evidence. On the other hand, this component is incredibly important and uncertain. And therefore, what we need to do from this very early stage where we're thinking about evidence generation to presenting evidence towards committees and funding decisions, that we've collected this evidence and presented it in the right format. So I think it is very challenging, and we'll never resolve it. I don't think you're ever going to get to the point where you think, oh yeah, we've got such a great evidence base that it's going to solve everything. I think we need to maximize the potential for getting as close to that as possible and fully exploring the consequences for the limitations of that from your perspective and the decision maker's perspective, and looking to kind of risk share across that.
Thank you, Chris. And I think you bring up quite a few very important points there. And I'll start off with the first one I've picked up, and that's around the payer acceptance of uncertainty. And maybe, Gianluigi, would you be able to comment on how you feel health systems accept that level of uncertainty in the evidence space?
I mean, uncertainty is part of the game, and we have to deal with it for almost all drugs, even when we have a large phase 3 trial available, because then we know when we move from clinical to day-to-day practice, then we have to face, to assess all our uncertainties, specifically for gene or cell therapies. I think what is really needed is, first of all, to focus on hard endpoints. You mentioned in your introduction the choice of a surrogate endpoint. This is just enhancing the uncertainty. This is, in my opinion, gene therapies, taking the definition, the gene therapy, the purpose is to achieve a durable expression of a gene in order to ameliorate or cure the disease. Then we need to focus on core symptoms, core characteristics, and let me say this is a place where overall survival may play a great role, mainly when we deal with studies in cancer setting. The second source of uncertainty is the short-term duration of trials. Although, I mean, as a health authority, we are most of the time focused on the yearly budget, and I'm talking about the country where I live, which is a budget impact archetype. However, the duration of studies is key in order to offer at least a medium term, let me say, 3 to 5 years scenario. I just learned that yesterday the Food and Drug Administration refused to grant the marketing approval to gene therapy for hemophilia A, claiming that at least the manufacturer has to provide 2 years data. I think this is quite important news, because as a payer, 2 years is really the minimum requirement. I'm very glad to hear that regulators are somewhat aligning themselves to such a need. The other point we have to deal with is safety. And again, it's a matter of collecting long-term data. We know we have insertional mutagenesis as well as the impact on immune response linked to the vectors. Several tools are implemented in order to minimize those potential tolerability issues, but nevertheless, long-term, and again, at least 2 years safety data are needed in order to minimize the uncertainty, to make it somewhat understandable, and also to set on that what Chris already said is a kind of risk sharing agreement on that.
Okay. And I think we're talking about some of the solutions to mitigate that evidence generation. And Chris, you spoke around the early model and sharing where those evidence gaps are and being able to fill those at an earlier stage. And Gianluigi, you've talked around the potential for risk sharing moving forward. Raf, maybe I could ask you the question: what other ways can the gap in evidence generation be mitigated?
Thank you, James. First, let me also express that I'm in agreement with what Gianluigi said just now, is that not everything is very new on gene and cell therapies. And so if you look at whatever drug that's developed for an ultra-orphan indication, you always have the same issues of not enough patients, not enough time, high probable benefit, so short timeline to approval, not enough data to prove that your product is indeed worth what it is worth, etc. So there's no real difference in that field. And so the ways to mitigate the problems are also not that different for this particular aspect, because what you do is, for example, you have to make sure that you have a much better idea about historical controls, and you have to pay attention as a company that what you show in your many times single arm trial, so what you have to compare to historical controls, that you also do this in such a way that you mitigate the differences that are caused by inhomogeneity of the patients in your trial versus what in real life is around as patients. So these are typical things that you would do, and indeed, as you can't get rid fully of the uncertainty with these products, both the ultra-orphans and the cell and gene therapies, the authorities, the regulatory authorities, grant many times a conditional approval, and you'll have to go into debates with the pricing and reimbursement authorities to get to an agreement that indeed the product is worth paying for what it's worth, and that leads then many times to pay for performance or other ways of patient access schemes in order to get somewhere a balance. But the biggest difference, in my view, between the ultra-orphans and the cell and gene therapies is what cell and gene therapies are promising to deliver. And so that's exactly the difference, is that many of them, also those in development, are promising no less than a cure of certain diseases that have short and long-term large consequences. So we can debate a long time about how you will prove the value of a product. The problem will not be solved when you prove that. Once you prove that the product is doing what it is expected to do, you have a product which, according to the current rules of valuing a therapy, is extremely expensive and can be extremely expensive. We all have seen the way that, for example, Novartis was explaining that their price for Zolgensma was not extravagant, not if you looked at it from a cost effectiveness standpoint, not if you looked at it in replacing therapy. So that's not the key issue. The key issue is that if you can prove that such a product has this high value, then you have to figure out how you solve the affordability part. And yes, you can do this with the first ones by making simple patient access schemes, etc. But there are so many in development. This could be over a number of years the dominant way of therapy of orphan and ultra-orphan diseases, and maybe even some regular diseases. So where you really have to think about another way to finance these systems. Okay, was maybe not your question, James. You were asking to evidence generation, how to get that better. I think I gave the answer also there already in what is possible. So better work on historical comparators, on the so historical evolution, making sure, I think doing your job as good as possible, showing that diagnosis, treatment with the product, measurement, follow-up of the patients, etc., either already fits or will be made fitting to the current patient journey as it's existing in the different countries where you are negotiating access. So, I could keep on for a long term on this, but maybe a comment on the long-term benefit. Again, there, I put the point that there are some issues with cell and gene therapies, and we know this certainly from the early years of these products. They can cause, in the early years, there was a big accident with leukemia as a result of a treatment, and you can never exclude it on the long term. What you're doing with the genes might have a negative effect in different ways. You can also never fully say that the product will per se work in an individual patient. There's the whole issue of antibodies that can already exist because of the viral vector that you're using, etc. So these are uncertainties that are there. So an uncertainty is you're never sure it works, and you're never sure about long-term outcome of the therapy. Well, a lot of the cancer therapies, for example, that are currently used plenty in the market have the same points. You're never sure that they will do what they are promising to do, and you are never sure what will happen on the long term. For example, very well known, if you have a good treatment for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, know that 8 years after the treatment, you have a high risk of getting an other cancer. Or let's say the risk that you get an other cancer because of your treatment will be bigger than the non-Hodgkin's coming back. So, I mean, these are published information, it's easy to double check. So these are inherent problems, again, that are not specific to cell and gene therapies, but there might be more drastic. It's like, yes, a gene therapy may influence on fertility, may influence on changes that goes to the children. It's possible. Yes, but a lot of other therapies may also do that, and a lot of them are on the market where we know that they do that. So, for me, the key point always remains, if it's really delivering what you hope it delivers, you have an extreme value of a product. And how are you going to cope with that? Okay, I think I said enough. Probably.
Thank you. Thank you, Raf. And we're certainly going to move on to how we're going to pay for it and the reimbursement and affordability. But before we move away from the evidence generation side of these. I'd very much like to hear from you, Chris, around the modelling aspect of this. We've heard from Raf around the historic control or natural history and how we can pull that in. Effectively, we're looking at a long-term model given a single treatment. What are the challenges involved in developing that from your experience?
Well, building a model to bring together all the different sort of parameters into something that produces those figures that reimbursement agencies use, like the cost per quality, is absolutely essential. And what you need to do is sort of sit down and identify all those elements where you think there are the possible comparators, there are the possible options that can occur, the side effects, the sort of the cure, and all these sorts of things going on. And this model has to be an abstract but reasonably realistic reflection of the real world that can demonstrate what's going on now and can demonstrate counterfactually what will happen if your new treatment comes along. And so if you think, for example, your new treatment brings a cure or your new treatment has fewer side effects than the existing ones, then somebody who's built the model for you should be able to point at it and say, well, actually, this is explicitly where we're capturing that type of benefit. And once you start bringing that together and populating that, you can start to understand what the key drivers are. So, for example, I mean, I've mentioned I did the industry model for Holoclaw for NICE, and we did that in a way which is the opposite of what I'm telling you to do, because they brought us in very last minute, and it was incredibly difficult to do, and I'm really pleased we got a good outcome for that. But once we put the model together, and Holoclaw was all about limbal stem cell deficiency, which is an eye problem, and it usually occurs because some idiot has thrown acid in your face and destroys the visual acuity in one eye. And we sort of built a model around improving visual acuity, etc. But it turned out, actually, and I think this refers back to a point Raf made, that one of the key drivers, and it occurred to us quite late, was the fact that if it's unresolved, then they have these flare-ups. These flare-ups cost £2,500 a go in terms of autologous eye serum costs, and these happen about twice a year. And actually, it was establishing that was one of the key drivers of value in the model and the reasons why this was accepted. So it was nothing to do with improvements in visual acuity. Well, it was something to do with that, but the main driver was the fact you're avoiding £5,000 of treatment costs a year if you can resolve this. Mm. We didn't realize that until quite late. We had to rely on expert opinion in the committee meetings actually to justify that. And thankfully, the NICE committee bought it. But if we'd done this much earlier on and we'd identified this as a key driver, then we could have spent much of our time demonstrating the evidence base on this. Basically, if it was 2 times or more a year, this thing was cost effective. And if it was less than that, it rapidly became not cost effective. So it would have been really, really good to have built up a good evidence base on that particular element. And that is something that you might not need a randomized controlled trial to do, because it's just the rate at which people had these flare-ups having had the disease. So that's exactly the sort of thing you could have picked up from observational data or a registry or something. And we ended up at the risk of the committee not believing our 2 experts. They did, thankfully. But you can see if we start to think about these, how all the bits of evidence fit together to make that compelling evidence, we can identify those bits which are really compelling, which are really necessary, and therefore build a compelling evidence base around that.
Super.
Just one more point on that as well, because of the measuring the long-term benefits. Usually, if you've just got evidence for trials about quality of life or costs, etc., you can just kind of plug them in and say, these are what these costs are. As soon as you start moving away from what you've established in the evidence base, then the role for modeling becomes even bigger. So, for example, the obvious one is survival analysis. You know, your trials last 2 years, but it changes the rate of mortality such that people now have expectations of 15, 20 years life expectancy. I remember doing something on knee surgery, which was extrapolating 50 years into the future. Now, committees accept these things have to be done, and they don't want to wait 50 years in order to make a decision. So you have to do a lot of sensitivity analysis around these as well. So you use the best techniques you can, and there are documents like decision support unit documents out there to help choose the best techniques to take the evidence you have and make those more robust predictions. But it's all about understanding the variation and the uncertainty around that. So one of the things we always like to do is understand how far in the future we need to extrapolate before something becomes cost effective. So, you know, if we take a life expectancy or life perspective on this, we might be looking 30 years in the future, which sounds, in the trial's only 2 years, which sounds relying a lot on the extrapolation. But actually, it might be the case when we fully explore the health economic model that the cutoff point it becomes cost effective after just 4 years. Mm. So you can understand actually, okay, the model takes a lifetime perspective, but actually we only really need data for 4 years in order to see whether this thing is cost effective or not. It's about that understanding and building all this in a conceptual framework, which you will have to do anyway, of course, at some point, really helps give you that early insight into the importance of various elements.
Thank you, Chris. I think we've touched on a number of points already in terms of the next section, and I'm mindful of time, and I do want to get through these 3 topics. So I'm going to move slightly into the reimbursement and affordability, and maybe Gianluigi, starting with yourself. You mentioned before around the ability to collect data. And given that we probably all within the webinar know of the innovative types of contracts that Italy are renowned for and probably world leading, my specific question around this is there the data capability to support these novel payment mechanisms that are often required for the high-cost medicines?
We have some cases we can take into consideration in order to answer your question. But first of all, I have to say Italy matured more than 10 years experience in the so-called outcome-based arrangements. And that nowadays the authority is convinced, is aware those kind of arrangements should be reserved to very specific settings, such as, for instance, gene therapy or CAR T-cell therapy, where we have to, on one side, we have a very high price, high cost per patient, and on the other, we have quite a huge uncertainty, and we already discussed about. So based on that, I would like just to refer the case of Strimvelis, which was the first gene therapy approved in my country, and the price, for instance, was set. The same price was accepted by the NICE, but then this was based on a payment by result, where the 100% payback was due if after 12 months the patient was intolerant without any specific definition, or there is a lack of efficacy, including the death of a patient. We had already only 2 patients treated in 2017, but then on that ground, Novartis and the AIFA, they build up the success fee agreement governing the reimbursement of Kymriah. And what is interesting is not only Kymriah, Novartis agreed, accepted the proposal of different success fee-based installments over a year period of time, and the success criterion was is very simple. It is a success if the patient is alive. This is, maybe is a little bit naive, but what is key is based on the experience, to know that based on the experience matured, it's really difficult in clinical practice, even when we deal with specialists, to define, let me say, a more sophisticated endpoint. So black and white, like dead or alive, is the best way to assess the efficacy and then to link it to a payment. In addition, when we look at the arrangement set for Kymriah, they were also able to apply in a certain way also an indication based agreement. We know Kymriah has two slightly different indications, and so when we look at the agreement achieved, taking into account all patients are tracked by means of web-based registries. In addition, this drug, as well as, for instance, Yescarta or other drugs, are the use restricted to very highly specialized centers. Then it looks like feasible to collect, and I'm back to your question, to collect data in order to support not only the payment of installments, but also to support the medium-term efficacy and safety of those treatments. I expect, for instance, this kind of scheme is likely to be applied also for the next coming gene therapies, namely Zolgensma and the gene therapy for hemoglobinopathy B, for which are likely to be concluded.
Thank you, Gianluigi. And maybe expanding upon that, on your last statement there around what's going to happen in the future, Raf. Do you see these types of contracts, these longer term agreements, are they always going to be in place for cell and gene therapies, or how do you see that evolving?
Let me first comment that the very first bullet point here, these are high-cost medicines, normally means that you classify it somewhere in a class where you have high-cost medicines. These products may also be very high-value products. And that's why it's logical that you see these payment models that are like pay for performance, looking about outcomes on longer term, etc. And Kymriah has this in several countries where this is clear. You know, Germany, Italy, Spain are applying that. So in other words, many markets are able to follow this for at least a small number of products. If you get a lot of gene therapies, gene and cell therapies, well, then of course it becomes complicated. And I think that it's probably always organizable if the systems are developed in such a way that this can be very much automized. Doing this for every product separately on an agreement, somebody that has to look every time if you get really the result which has been promised, and that can be by patient, by individual patient, even like for Kymriah. Well, then obviously that would be very complicated if you have to do it that way. It has to be easier and simpler to do this on a larger scale. So the countries that don't gather these data, they do have a bigger problem. There it's more like, okay, coverage with evidence development is a way to say we are going to pay for it now, and we'll see later on if it was right to do so. It's another approach that will work also, although it doesn't solve the issue in the end, that if the product is of very high value for a patient, that you still need to be able to afford that product. So in other words, your system needs to be able to pay for that. And that always will bring us back to other ways of payment strategies for these products you can think about doing it for a few, but how do you do this for a lot of products? I think that's where the key question mark sits. So assuming that products are able to prove their value, obviously.
Thank you, Raf. And that brings me on very nicely into the next section. And Chris, my first question would be for you, and picking up on what Raf said there around how health systems are able to automate the collection of data. In the UK, is the UK prepared for, I'm not going to call it an influx, but an increase in the number of cell and gene therapies that may come into the market over the next few years, and being able to capture the data required?
I think it's a bit yes and no. I think it's entirely plausible to do that. I think the infrastructure's there. There are real issues, I think, with data governance, of course, which will dog this and actually provide a headache for research in general. Anyway, I mean, going back slightly, I think I agree completely. There's two reasons why you need these kind of payment models and pricing strategies. The main one here is just the uncertainty, but as Raf, I think, kind of mentioned, there's also the budget impact as well. If it is likely that it's going to have a substantial short-term impact on the available resources, then there often needs to be modeling around that. I think we're getting there in terms of being slightly pragmatic about this, in terms of identifying what are the really important issues about the uncertainty, that the risk is shared across both industry and the NHS. And I think industry should also consider that when it agrees to a pricing model or a risk-sharing model, it's also sending signals about their private information about the product as well. I mean, it's well accepted, of course, that there's an information asymmetry here, and that the individual companies probably know a lot more about the particular products than they put in a reimbursement dossier. And NICE and NHS know this. And if the industry signals it will risk share, then that is sending a strong signal that, you know, it's not trying to pull the wool over the NHS's eyes. If on the other hand it says, no, you have to take all the risk, then that kind of not only loads the risk on the NHS, but it also sends a rather negative signal as well. But getting back to the original question a bit about whether the NHS or NICE are able to sort of collect these kind of registries. I think it's been difficult in the past. It's absolutely plausible to do that, but certainly in the past, NICE haven't had the legal obligation, the ability to apply that legal obligation for that data to be collected. So they've been very, very wary in the past of saying yes to something, but you have to do the data collection, because the company can say yes to that and then not bother to do the data collection. There's nothing NICE can do about that. So bearing that in mind, they haven't gone down that route too often. So I think it's not just data governance, it's not just a capital infrastructure about whether it's possible, but there's also a very strong a legal argument that has to be considered as well, in terms of whether they're obliged to commit to what they say they will do when their profit incentives might be not to do that. But I think it will emerge over time, because there will be this pressure. The NICE do want to get cost-effective medications available, and they don't want to hinder innovation. So I think there will be pressure to develop it, but I think that it is a bit of a tricky path that we're going down. I think there will be ad hoc solutions to this, but I think it would be great if industry could think about this a little bit in advance and share and help and really indicate that they are prepared to be involved in this data collection process.
And thank you, Chris. And Gianluigi, thinking about that sort of risk sharing and the industry sharing responsibility for that data collection, is that something you're seeing in Italy? How is that process in your agreements working?
Based on what is done, it's pretty good, because again, we have a long-lasting experience with managing web-based registries, and I would like to just to underline that those registries are directly managed by the Italian agency. In other words, the data collected are assessed directly by the authority and not just provided by manufacturers. And this is key in order to avoid to minimize the risk of bias in reporting the outcome in, let me say, what we can define as real-world evidence. The experience of the Italian authority is also not to use a single tool in order to make this kind of drugs affordable. Just refer to what Ralph said. The head of the Italian Society of Thalassemia, he recently stated that gene therapy is not for everybody. So in other words, is the role of payers in a cooperation with the scientific societies is to identify the patient profile representing a priority for for being treated with gene therapy. And that's the reason why, for instance, while preparing for reimbursing the gene treatment for beta thalassemia I just mentioned before, the society, they already defined a subgroup of patients, and they were really clear on the selection criteria in order to identify those patients who are more likely to benefit from the treatment, and that's the reason why they represent a priority. The same approach was used at the time CAR T-cell has been reimbursed by the Italian authority, both the authority and the Italian Society of Hematologists. They work together in order to select the patient criteria, in addition to select centers, because not all centers may be allowed to treat patients with CAR T-cell or gene therapies. My final point is the following. The Italian authority is also working on reducing costs, and that's the reason why in April last year, the Italian Ministry of Health funded 5 million euros in order to assess the feasibility of allowing centers to manufacture by themselves CAR T-cell. In other words, the purpose is to achieve an agreement with manufacturers where some selected centers are allowed to manufacture the drug, the cells, to modify the cells by themselves, thus improving all the issues related to supply capacity, in addition to reduce costs. I think this is another way in order to approach, for instance, CAR T-cell, where the raw material is the cells of each patient.
Thank you, Gianluigi, and it's a very interesting case around the CAR T-cell therapies, and maybe expanding upon that quite more broadly. Raf, thinking about the role of industry in the delivery or the service delivery of these products, what do you feel that the industry should be doing, or what role do you think the industry has to play in this?
Oh, yeah. I see the supply chain issues on this bracket, and you know that especially the production of the factors can be a problem, and making sure that runs well for the approval for gene and cell therapies. That's one of the big problems. So I can imagine that you put the accent towards working closer to the site of delivery, and that companies do that and set up systems to do that, as they do in many fields, and probably already do in some cases. So means that they know the product well. They can set up service delivery for a product if that's a very specific technique that they know well. Once what they deliver is in common with many other products, then you know that it's wiser to think about somebody else doing this. And so, I mean, you cannot have with one center 50 different services for delivery of gene and cell therapy. Actually, you can, but again, it becomes very complicated. So, in the beginning, certainly, as time goes by and they are more available, I assume that there will be more products that will be given in vivo. And in that case, of course, you have pure gene therapy, and that will be in its model for distribution somewhat simpler.
Thank you, Raf. Thank you very much. I'm aware we're coming towards the end. There is an opportunity to ask any questions, so if you do have any questions, then please put them into the questions on the right-hand side here, and I'm sure we'll get to them. I'm going to try and summarize in a couple of minutes everything that we've talked about, and I think on reflection, first of all, an hour or 52 minutes is nowhere near enough to talk about all the issues that cell and gene therapies have in the marketplace. Whether we're talking about the affordability or the payment mechanisms, or certainly how to demonstrate the long-term effects, either through modelling or through the real-world evidence. All of those issues firstly create, on one side for industry, difficulty in being able to demonstrate that, and I think we talked around some of the ways in which industry can do that, be that early planning, early modelling, really finding where the evidence gaps are, or whether it's on the payer, the health systems side, to think flexibly around the payment models that could be in place, and how they accept, or the level of acceptance, or the level of uncertainty that payers and health systems would expect within that. I think there are so many issues in terms of the evidence generation, in terms of the reimbursement and the infrastructure. And the nature of the products really is on such an individual basis as well. Each of them may have mortality benefits or quality of life benefits. So being able to plan ahead certainly is very clear. We do have a couple of questions in the audience here. Maybe Chris, would you like to pick up on the next question we have here around the acceptability to payers of current methods for analysing heterogeneous patient populations and survival data?
Sure, yes, and I think it also comes up with the question Jan's asked as well, so maybe I can kill two birds with one stone here. So I think they are amenable. Certainly some of the stuff we did for Holoclaw was certainly different to the usual types of analyses that we would put in economic evaluation models. You have to remember that the reimbursement agencies want to get good value, so they don't want to be turning away technologies that are cost effective. It's not quite that kind of conflict. So what I would do from your perspective is you need to understand how important this is, because as soon as you start introducing some additional sophistication, it's going to raise some additional questions, and you might get knocked back on that. So you have to be sure, is it worth it? And you do that with the early modeling, you do that with the simpler techniques. We should always use simpler where possible. And if the simpler technique is not capturing what you think the real value of this is, then you should be going for the more sophisticated techniques. but you need to justify it. You need to be able to persuade the committee you are doing it because the simple techniques are too simple to pick up the genuine effects here, rather than you're doing a different technique because the other one didn't give us the answer that we wanted. Now, committees like NICE use universities as the evidence review groups, so you've got academics that will go over this. So if you can present this in a clear way that illustrates exactly why you're doing it and how sensitive the results are to this sophistication, then my experience is they are actually quite amenable to it. And this sort of goes back on to Jan's question. You really need to understand how important this is to the overall decision. If it's not at all important, or it's marginally important, then going to all the effort of trying to produce this and the risk of introducing something that's a little bit different to what the committee might have seen and rejecting the sophistication, then why would it be worth it? But if this is vital to really demonstrate the value of your product, then I think go for it, and make sure you present it in the most compelling and clear way as you can in order to convince the academics that assess these things that actually this is the correct way of analysing this particular data.
Thank you very much, Chris. And unfortunately, we have run out of time for this this session. I was hoping to ask you each for recommendations, but we're at the top of the hour, so I am going to close it. First of all, I'd like to thank all our panelists, Chris, Gianluigi, and Raf, for your input into today's discussion. We have our next webinar in the Expert Insight series happening the 1st of October, which will be a follow-on to our first in Expert Insight series. So looking again through a global pandemic 6 months on, it was 6 months ago we first did this. If you would like to sign up, then obviously we have the listings and you will see it there. In the meantime, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. I hope you found it interesting. If you do have any further questions, then please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. In the meantime, I wish you all a good day and all the best for the rest of the week. Thank you very much.